In the spring of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in human history, a peculiar unit assembled in the English countryside. They carried no rifles. They fired no artillery. Yet this small band of soldiers would deceive the entire German high command and save thousands of American lives. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors dressed in military uniforms. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and they would become the most unusual secret weapon of World War II. Imagine, for a moment, standing on a French hillside in June 1944. Through the morning mist, you see an entire armored division rolling into position. Hundreds of tanks. Dozens of artillery pieces. Convoys of trucks stretching to the horizon. The rumble of engines fills the air. Radio chatter crackles with military communications. From every vantage point, this is unmistakably a massive concentration of American firepower preparing for battle. But if you were to walk down that hillside and place your hand upon one of those fearsome Sherman tanks, your fingers would sink into rubber. The entire division is a lie. An elaborate theatrical performance staged for an audience of German reconnaissance planes and intelligence officers. This is not fiction. This is not Hollywood fantasy. This is the true story of how 1,100 American soldiers, armed with nothing more than inflatable tanks, painted canvas, and sound effects, conducted some of the most audacious deceptions in military history. Operating in absolute secrecy, they impersonated entire divisions, fooling the Wehrmacht into making catastrophic strategic errors. They staged more than 20 battlefield deceptions across Europe, often working within earshot of enemy positions, their lives depending entirely on the success of their performances. The world knew nothing of their existence. For decades after the war ended, the men of the Ghost Army were forbidden from speaking about their service. The official records remained classified, buried in military archives. The soldiers who had painted fake tanks and carried inflatable artillery tubes returned to civilian life, their extraordinary contributions unknown even to their families. They had helped win the war in Europe, yet they could claim no credit, wear no special insignia, tell no stories. But the deception had to be perfect. In modern warfare, military intelligence relies on multiple sources of verification. German reconnaissance aircraft flew constant missions over Allied positions, photographing every concentration of forces. Ground observers watched through field glasses from distant church steeples and hilltops. Radio operators intercepted American communications, piecing together unit locations and movements. Resistance networks and civilian informants provided additional intelligence. For the Ghost Army's illusions to succeed, they had to fool not one intelligence system, but all of them simultaneously. A single error, one inconsistency detected by sharp German analysts, and the deception would collapse. The real American forces, wherever they were actually massing, would be exposed. The trap would snap shut on the deceivers themselves. The stakes could not have been higher. In 1944, the war hung in precarious balance. The D-Day landings had succeeded, but Allied forces clung to a narrow beachhead, fighting desperately to break out into France. Every German panzer division, every infantry regiment that could be drawn away from critical sectors and sent to counter phantom threats, represented real lives saved. If the Ghost Army could convince German commanders that a major American offensive was building in one location, the Wehrmacht might shift reserves, redeploy artillery, concentrate their limited forces against an enemy that existed only in paint and canvas and radio signals. Meanwhile, the real attack would strike elsewhere, against weakened defenses. The men who would execute these deceptions came from unexpected backgrounds. They were recruited from art schools and advertising agencies, from radio studios and theatrical companies. Some had studied at the finest design institutions in America. Others worked as billboard painters and window dressers. They were not trained soldiers in the traditional sense, though they would learn to march and shoot and follow orders. Their real weapons were creativity, technical skill, and an understanding of visual perception. They knew how shadows fell, how distance affected perspective, how the human eye could be tricked into seeing mass where only emptiness existed. As 1944 progressed and the liberation of Europe accelerated, this ghost army would move like shadows behind the real American forces, creating phantom divisions and disappearing army groups. They would stage their greatest performance during the crossing of the Rhine, convincing the Germans that the Ninth Army was preparing to force the river at a completely different location. They would operate so close to enemy lines that they could sometimes hear German voices drifting across the darkness. And through it all, they would maintain the most essential component of any successful deception: absolute, unwavering commitment to the illusion. This is the story of how imagination became a weapon of war, and how 1,000 men with paintbrushes and rubber tanks helped defeat the Third Reich. The concept of military deception was as old as warfare itself. Ancient commanders employed false camps and dummy soldiers. Wooden cannon had fooled besieging armies for centuries. But the ghost army represented something entirely new, a fully integrated, technically sophisticated deception unit designed to exploit every modern intelligence-gathering system simultaneously. The idea emerged from a simple observation: in modern mechanized warfare, armies had become too large to hide, so perhaps the solution was not to hide them, but to multiply them. To make the enemy see divisions that did not exist, forcing them to defend against threats that were mere phantoms. The architect of this concept was a British officer named Dudley Clarke, who had pioneered deception operations in North Africa. Clarke understood that successful battlefield deception required more than visual trickery. It demanded a complete narrative, a story told through multiple channels that would convince enemy intelligence analysts of its authenticity. In the desert campaigns against Rommel, Clarke had created entire fictional armies, complete with false radio traffic, fabricated orders, and carefully planted intelligence leaks. The Germans had shifted precious resources to counter these phantom forces, weakening their positions where the real attacks fell. American military planners, studying Clarke's successes, recognized the potential. In early 1944, as preparations for the cross-channel invasion intensified, the U.S. Army activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The unit's official designation was deliberately vague, designed to discourage questions. In practice, they became known by several nicknames: the Ghost Army, the Phantom Division, and among themselves simply the 23rd. Their mission was unprecedented, and their methods would have to be invented from scratch. Recruitment began in an unconventional manner. Army personnel officers combed through service records, searching not for combat veterans or weapons specialists, but for artists. The Philadelphia Museum's School of Industrial Art provided several recruits. The Pratt Institute contributed designers and illustrators. Fashion illustrators from New York advertising agencies found themselves receiving orders to report for special duty. Sound engineers from radio networks were pulled from their broadcasting studios. Even a professional magician joined the ranks, his skills and misdirection suddenly valuable to military intelligence. The unit assembled at Camp Forest in Tennessee, where an extraordinary training program began. The soldiers learned conventional military skills, marching, military courtesy, basic weapons handling. But their specialized training focused on dramatically different objectives. They studied camouflage theory and the physics of visual perception. They learned how aerial photography worked, what German reconnaissance cameras could detect, and how to manipulate shadows and scale to create convincing illusions from 10,000 feet altitude. Sound engineers developed techniques for recording and amplifying battlefield noises. Radio operators practiced mimicking the transmission patterns and communication styles of genuine combat units. The equipment they would deploy was equally unconventional. Engineers designed inflatable tanks that could be carried by 2 men and inflated in minutes using portable air compressors. These rubber Sherman tanks, when properly positioned and camouflaged with netting, appeared completely authentic from aerial observation. The inflatables weighed only a fraction of what real tanks weighed, yet from above they cast the correct shadows, displayed the proper dimensions, and when arranged in standard tactical formations, suggested a complete armored battalion. Artillery pieces received similar treatment. Inflatable howitzers, anti-aircraft guns, and supply trucks emerged from the workshops. Each dummy vehicle was carefully designed to match real equipment in every visual detail. Fabricators studied technical manuals and photographs, ensuring that track patterns, barrel lengths, and equipment stowage matched authentic vehicles precisely. Some dummies incorporated heating elements that would register on infrared detection equipment. Others included metal components that would reflect radar signals appropriately. But visual deception alone would not suffice. The Ghost Army's tactical deception officers understood that German intelligence would correlate visual observations with other data sources. Thus, the unit developed what they called sonic deception. Special engineering units designed and built equipment capable of projecting battlefield sounds across miles. They recorded actual tank movements, artillery fire, bridge construction, and troop movements. These recordings were then played through massive speakers and amplifier systems positioned near the dummy installations, creating an audible signature of military activity. A German listening post miles away would hear what seemed to be a mechanized division preparing for combat. Simultaneously, the signal company special within the Ghost Army would execute spoof radio operations. Skilled operators would mimic the radio procedures, transmission schedules, and message traffic of genuine American divisions. They studied how real units communicated, learned the distinctive fist or transmission style of individual radio operators, and created entirely fictional command structures that existed only in the electromagnetic spectrum. German radio intelligence units, constantly monitoring Allied communications, would intercept these transmissions and plot the Phantom Division's location based on signal strength and direction finding. The final element involved what the Ghost Army called special effects, or atmosphere. This required soldiers to physically impersonate officers and men of the units being simulated. They wore the shoulder patches of other divisions, visited nearby towns in these false uniforms, and deliberately engaged in loose talk in cafes and bars where enemy agents or sympathizers might overhear. They painted bumper markings on their vehicles identifying them as belonging to divisions that were actually hundreds of miles away. They staged conspicuous reconnaissance activities, sending small groups of men in clearly marked vehicles to scout terrain and ask local civilians about road conditions, ensuring that this intelligence would reach German ears. Each operation required meticulous planning. Deception officers would receive their mission, impersonate a specific division in a particular location for a defined period. They would then choreograph every element, where the inflatable tanks would be positioned, what radio traffic would be transmitted, which sounds would be played and when, what routes their marked vehicles would travel, even what careless conversations their men would have in local establishments. Every detail had to reinforce the central deception. Every element had to tell the same story. The men trained relentlessly. They practiced inflating their rubber tanks in darkness, learning to work silently and swiftly. They rehearsed moving the dummies into tactical positions that experienced German observers would recognize as authentic combat deployments. The sonic crews tested their equipment, refining the acoustics to create convincing illusions of distance and activity. The radio operators developed their false networks, creating fictional battalion commanders and supply officers whose voices would become familiar to German listeners. By June 1944, the Ghost Army was ready. They shipped to England as part of the vast build-up for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. They arrived as an unknown unit with an impossible mission: to multiply the Allied armies through pure deception, to make Adolf Hitler's generals see threats that existed only in imagination and rubber and radio waves. The real war was about to begin, and the ghost soldiers would fight it with tools no army had ever deployed before. The Ghost Army first deployed to France in the summer of 1944, landing at Utah Beach weeks after D-Day. They arrived in a combat zone where German resistance remained fierce and Allied advances measured in bloody yards. The bocage country of Normandy, with its ancient hedgerows and sunken lanes, had become a grinding meat grinder of infantry combat. Every field was contested. Every village cost lives. In this desperate environment, the phantom soldiers would stage their first battlefield deception. Their initial operation, codenamed Elephant, took place in mid-July near the town of St. Lo. The objective was to simulate the presence of the 2nd Armored Division in one sector, while the Real Division moved to attack elsewhere. The Ghost Army soldiers moved into position under cover of darkness, their trucks loaded with deflated rubber tanks and artillery pieces. They worked quickly and silently, knowing that German observation posts occupied the high ground only miles away. As dawn approached, an entire armored battalion materialized where none had existed hours before. The inflatable Shermans sat in proper tactical dispersal, positioned as real tanks would be when preparing for offensive operations. Camouflage netting draped over them, carefully arranged to appear hastily erected rather than perfectly positioned. Dummy artillery pieces occupied fire positions, their barrels angled toward German lines. The sonic unit set up their speakers in concealed locations, then began broadcasting the sounds of a mechanized unit, engines idling, tracks clanking, the metallic clatter of ammunition being loaded, shouted orders carrying across the morning air. Meanwhile, the radio operators established their phantom command network. Transmissions crackled through the ether, reporting unit positions, requesting supply information, coordinating with artillery observers. The messages used proper military procedure and authentic code words. They reference real terrain features and actual tactical situations. To German radio intelligence operators listening intently, filtering American communications through their headphones, this was clearly a major armored formation preparing for combat operations. The special effects teams executed their part of the performance with equal precision. Soldiers wearing the 2nd Armored Division's shoulder patches drove jeeps along nearby roads, making themselves conspicuously visible. They stopped at crossroads to consult maps, ensuring that local civilians would observe their presence and their unit identification. In the nearest town, Ghost Army soldiers visited cafes and shops, again wearing the distinctive Hell on Wheels patch of the 2nd Armored. They asked questions about the local area, discussed where good tank terrain might be found, and generally behaved like soldiers preparing for combat who were perhaps slightly less discreet than they should be. The deception worked. German intelligence reports noted a significant American armored presence in the sector. Wehrmacht commanders, believing they faced an imminent tank assault, reinforced their positions in that area. Artillery was shifted to cover the anticipated attack routes. Infantry reserves moved into blocking positions. And crucially, German attention and resources focused on the phantom threat, while miles away, the real 2nd Armored Division struck against weakened defenses, achieving its objectives with fewer casualties than anticipated. Operation Elephant was merely the beginning. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and swept across France in August 1944, the Ghost Army conducted operation after operation. They impersonated the 6th Armored Division near Brest, convincing German defenders that a major assault was coming from an unexpected direction. They simulated the 79th Infantry Division in the Loire Valley, holding German attention while real American forces maneuvered elsewhere. Each deception followed the same pattern: careful planning, precise execution, and the weaving of multiple deception threads into a single convincing narrative. The work was exhausting and dangerous. The rubber tanks, despite their light weight, were cumbersome and difficult to maneuver into position. Soldiers wrestled with the dummies in darkness and rain, inflating them with portable compressors that sputtered and occasionally failed. The camouflage netting, essential to the illusion, had to be positioned perfectly, creating shadows that aerial photographs would read as authentic. One poorly placed dummy, one shadow falling at an impossible angle, and German photo interpreters might detect the deception. The sonic operations presented their own challenges. The sound equipment was temperamental and required constant maintenance. Speakers had to be positioned to project sound convincingly across the landscape without revealing their location. The recordings had to be played at precisely calibrated volumes, loud enough to be heard by German listeners but not so loud as to seem artificial. Operators monitored German positions constantly, adjusting the sonic presentation based on wind conditions, terrain features, and the estimated location of enemy observation posts. Radio deception demanded equal precision. The operators had to maintain their false networks 24 hours a day, matching the communication rhythm of real units. They could not simply broadcast randomly. Actual military radio traffic followed predictable patterns. Morning reports, supply requests, coordination with adjacent units, artillery fire missions, all of these had to be simulated in proper sequence and with authentic detail. The radio operators became method actors, inhabiting the roles of battalion commanders and company captains who existed only in the electromagnetic spectrum. As autumn arrived and Allied forces approached the German border, the operations became more sophisticated. The Ghost Army conducted Operation Bettemberg in Luxembourg, simulating 2 entire divisions along a quiet section of the front. For nearly 2 weeks, they maintained this massive deception, creating the impression that American forces were massing for a major offensive in that sector. The Germans, convinced by the phantom buildup, held significant forces in position to counter the anticipated attack. Meanwhile, the real American thrust came elsewhere, against lighter resistance. The soldiers learned to improvise and adapt. When inflatable equipment was damaged or unavailable, they constructed visual deceptions from whatever materials they could find. Plywood silhouettes of trucks and tanks, when properly painted and positioned, could fool aerial observers. Canvas stretched over wooden frames created convincing artillery pieces. The artists in the unit, accustomed to working with limited resources, found creative solutions to technical problems. They studied how light fell on real vehicles, then replicated those patterns on their dummies. They understood perspective and proportion, ensuring that their creations would appear authentic from the specific vantage points that mattered: aerial reconnaissance cameras and distant German observation posts. Not every operation succeeded perfectly. Occasionally, German intelligence saw through specific elements of the deception. But the Ghost Army's strength lay in redundancy and depth. Even if one component of the illusion failed, if a dummy was recognized or a radio transmission seemed suspicious, the other elements continued to support the overall narrative. The cumulative effect of visual, sonic, and radio deception proved far more convincing than any single element alone. The men developed pride in their craft. They were soldiers, but they were also artists and engineers executing extraordinarily difficult technical challenges under combat conditions. They took satisfaction in learning that a particular operation had successfully deceived German intelligence, that their phantom divisions had drawn real enemy forces away from critical sectors. They understood that their work saved lives, even though they would never receive traditional combat recognition. By December 1944, as winter settled over Europe and the Germans launched their desperate Ardennes offensive, the Ghost Army had become expert deceivers. They had conducted more than a dozen major operations, each one adding to their understanding of how to fool a sophisticated enemy. They had learned what worked and what did not, refining their techniques with each new mission. And they were about to face their greatest challenge: the crossing of the Rhine River and the final drive into the heart of Nazi Germany. As March 1945 arrived, the Allied armies stood along the western bank of the Rhine River, preparing for the final thrust into Germany's industrial heartland. The Rhine represented Hitler's last major natural defense line. Its swift current and steep eastern banks made it a formidable obstacle. German forces, though battered by months of retreat, defended the crossing sites with desperate determination. Every bridge was destroyed. Every ford was covered by artillery. The Wehrmacht knew that once the Allies crossed the Rhine in force, the war was effectively lost. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery planned to force the Rhine near the town of Wesel in the north, where the British Second Army and the U.S. Ninth Army would strike together in Operation Plunder. But the Germans expected this. Their intelligence had identified the likely crossing sites. They'd positioned their remaining panzer divisions and artillery to contest the crossing. For the operation to succeed with acceptable casualties, the German defenders needed to be confused about exactly where and when the main assault would come. This was precisely the mission the Ghost Army had trained for. The deception operation, codenamed Viersen, was the most ambitious the unit had ever attempted. The objective was to convince German intelligence that the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine at a location nearly 30 miles south of the actual crossing site. If successful, German reserves would move to defend against a phantom threat, leaving the real crossing point more lightly defended. The operation would require every deception capability the Ghost Army possessed, executed flawlessly over a 2-week period, within artillery range of German positions. The Ghost Army moved into the deception area in early March, taking extreme care to avoid detection during their approach. They traveled at night, with all unit markings covered. The inflatable tanks and equipment came forward in unmarked trucks. Nothing could reveal their presence prematurely. The deception had to unfold gradually, naturally, exactly as a real division preparing for combat would reveal itself to enemy observation. Over several days, the Phantom Division materialized. Inflatable tanks appeared in assembly areas, positioned in the exact tactical formations that American armored units used when staging for offensive operations. Dummy artillery moved into firing positions, their barrels oriented toward logical crossing points. Supply dumps grew visibly larger, stocked with convincing piles of material, empty crates arranged to look like ammunition, camouflaged fuel storage tanks that were actually just painted canvas, maintenance areas where rubber tanks sat as if being serviced. The visual deception alone was extraordinary, but the Ghost Army coordinated it with equally sophisticated sonic and radio operations. Each night, the sonic units broadcast the sounds of a mechanized division preparing for combat. The recordings included bridge construction noises, suggesting that engineers were secretly building crossing equipment under cover of darkness. Tanks' motors rumbled throughout the night, implying that armored battalions were moving into final assault positions. The sounds carried across the river, where German listening posts recorded every noise, analyzing the audio intelligence, and reporting the presence of significant American forces. Radio operations reached unprecedented complexity. The spoof radio network simulated not just one division, but an entire corps headquarters coordinating multiple units. Phantom staff officers transmitted planning messages. Fictional artillery observers called in registration fires, actually coordinating with real artillery batteries who fired rounds that made the radio traffic seem authentic. Supply officers requested bridging equipment, fuel, and ammunition in quantities appropriate for a major river crossing operation. Intelligence officers broadcast reconnaissance reports, describing German positions on the eastern bank with accurate detail that suggested serious operational planning. The special effects teams executed their most daring performances. Soldiers wearing Ninth Army shoulder patches conducted highly visible reconnaissance along the river banks in the deception sector. They carried surveying equipment, took photographs, consulted maps, and made notes, all in clear view of German observation posts across the Rhine. Engineering officers, actually Ghost Army soldiers in disguise, inspected potential crossing sites with obvious professional interest. In nearby towns, American soldiers wearing the appropriate insignia frequented cafes and establishments, speaking carelessly about the upcoming operation, dropping hints about crossing dates and locations that German intelligence networks would inevitably intercept. The danger was immense. The Ghost Army operated within range of German artillery. The inflatable tanks sat in open fields where any serious bombardment would destroy them instantly and expose the deception. The men working to maintain the illusion, inflating damaged dummies, repositioning equipment, operating the sonic systems, worked in constant awareness that German observers might be watching through field glasses from the far bank. A single artillery barrage could annihilate the deception and kill the deceivers. Yet they maintained the performance day after day. Each morning brought new challenges, equipment failures, whether that damaged the dummies, the constant physical exhaustion of operating a completely fictional division. The artists painted and repainted camouflage as conditions changed. The radio operators maintained their 24-hour networks, never breaking character, always transmitting messages that fit the narrative. The sonic crews broadcast their recordings on schedule, creating the audible signature of an army preparing for battle. German intelligence responded exactly as hoped. Reconnaissance flights photographed the Phantom Division repeatedly. Photo interpreters analyzed the images, noting the steady buildup of forces in the deception sector. Radio intelligence units tracked the Phantom Command Network, mapping what they believed was the Ninth Army's order of battle. Ground observers reported the sounds of construction and tank movements. Agent networks confirmed American presence through eyewitness reports from civilians who had interacted with the disguised ghost army soldiers. Wehrmacht commanders, studying this accumulating intelligence, concluded that a major American crossing was being prepared in the southern sector. They shifted precious reserves to defend against the threat. Artillery was repositioned. Infantry battalions moved into blocking positions along the eastern bank opposite the deception area. Panzer units, desperately needed elsewhere, were held in reserve behind what German intelligence identified as the threatened sector. The trap had closed around a ghost. On the night of March 23, 1945, the real assault began 30 miles north. British and American forces stormed across the Rhine near Wesel, supported by massive artillery barrages and airborne drops. The Germans, caught with forces out of position, could not mass sufficient strength to contest the crossing effectively. The bridgehead expanded rapidly. Within days, Allied armor was pouring across the Rhine, driving deep into Germany. German intelligence responded exactly as hoped. Reconnaissance flights photographed the Phantom Division repeatedly. Photo interpreters analyzed the images, noting the steady buildup of forces in the deception sector. Radio intelligence units tracked the Phantom Command Network, mapping what they believed was the Ninth Army's order of battle. Ground observers reported the sounds of construction and tank movements. Agent networks confirmed American presence through eyewitness reports from civilians who had interacted with the disguised ghost army soldiers. Wehrmacht commanders, studying this accumulating intelligence, concluded that a major American crossing was being prepared in the southern sector. They shifted precious reserves to defend against the threat. Artillery was repositioned. Infantry battalions moved into blocking positions along the eastern bank opposite the deception area. Panzer units, desperately needed elsewhere, were held in reserve behind what German intelligence identified as the threatened sector. The trap had closed around a ghost. On the night of March 23, 1945, the real assault began 30 miles north. British and American forces stormed across the Rhine near Wesel, supported by massive artillery barrages and airborne drops. The Germans, caught with forces out of position, could not mass sufficient strength to contest the crossing effectively. The bridgehead expanded rapidly. Within days, Allied armor was pouring across the Rhine, driving deep into Germany. The Ghost Army had executed its masterpiece. Operation Viersen succeeded completely, contributing directly to the success of one of the war's critical operations. The Phantom Division had drawn real German forces to defend against an attack that never came, weakening the defenses where the actual crossing occurred. How many Allied lives were saved by this deception cannot be precisely calculated, but senior commanders later estimated that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of soldiers survived the Rhine crossing because German resistance was lighter than expected. For the men of the Ghost Army, there was no time for celebration. They struck their Phantom Division quickly, deflating the rubber tanks, packing the equipment, erasing the traces of their presence. Within hours, the deception site was empty, as if the division had never existed. And the Ghost Army moved forward into Germany, already planning their next operation, their next impossible illusion. For decades, the Ghost Army remained unknown. The soldiers resumed their careers as artists, designers, engineers, and businessmen. Some became famous in their fields. Fashion designer Bill Blass had served in the unit, as had photographer Art Kane and painter Ellsworth Kelly. They achieved recognition for their civilian work, but they could not speak about perhaps their most remarkable achievement, fooling Hitler's armies with imagination and rubber. The official records remained locked in classified archives. The inflatable tanks were destroyed or stored in forgotten warehouses. The sonic equipment was dismantled. The techniques and tactics the Ghost Army had pioneered languished in secret files, unavailable even to military historians studying the war. The deception operations, which had been so critical to Allied success, appeared in no histories, no memoirs, no official accounts. The silence finally broke in the 1990s, 50 years after the war. The U.S. Army declassified the Ghost Army's records, finally allowing the story to emerge. Aging veterans, many now in their 70s and 80s, could at last discuss what they had done during the war. Historians gained access to operational reports, photographs, and documentation that revealed the scope and sophistication of the deceptions. The public learned for the first time about the artists and sound engineers who had wielded imagination as a weapon. The historical significance of the Ghost Army extends beyond their specific tactical contributions. They represented a fundamental evolution in military thinking about deception. Earlier wars had employed deception sporadically and often crudely. The Ghost Army demonstrated that deception could be systematic, sophisticated, and integrated into operational planning at the highest levels. They proved that properly executed deception could achieve strategic effects out of all proportion to the resources invested. Their techniques influenced post-war military doctrine. Modern armies studied the Ghost Army's methods, developing their own deception capabilities based on the principles the unit had pioneered. The integration of visual, electronic, and behavioral deception became standard military practice. The idea that a small specialized unit could multiply friendly forces and paralyze enemy decision-making became accepted military wisdom. The Ghost Army also represented something uniquely American, the application of creativity and innovation to military problems. These were not traditional soldiers executing established doctrine. They were artists and engineers improvising solutions to unprecedented challenges. They brought civilian creativity into military service, proving that imagination and technical skill could be as valuable as firepower. In a war dominated by industrial mass production and overwhelming material superiority, the Ghost Army fought with ingenuity. The individual stories of the Ghost Army veterans revealed the human dimension of this extraordinary service. These men spent months living with the constant tension of operating near enemy lines, knowing that their lives depended entirely on the success of their deceptions. They worked in conditions of extreme stress, maintaining complex illusions while German observation posts watched and artillery could strike at any moment. They experienced the peculiar psychological pressure of being soldiers who never fired a shot in anger but whose work directly influenced the outcome of battles. Some veterans struggled with the decades of enforced silence. They had participated in operations they considered important, perhaps the most significant thing they had ever done, yet they could tell no one. They watched movies and read books about the war, seeing accounts that never mentioned the deceptions they had executed. They attended veteran reunions where combat soldiers shared their stories, while the Ghost Army men remained silent, bound by their oaths of secrecy. The eventual declassification brought recognition but also reflection. Many Ghost Army veterans expressed satisfaction that their story had finally emerged, that their service was acknowledged. They took pride in learning that military historians considered their work significant. They appreciated that younger generations could now understand how the war had been won not only through courage and firepower but also through imagination and deception. The physical evidence of the Ghost Army's work has largely vanished. The inflatable tanks were either destroyed or deteriorated decades ago. A few artifacts survive in museums: photographs of the dummies in position, some of the sonic equipment, operational maps marked with deception plans. These fragments offer tangible connection to operations that once fooled an entire nation's military intelligence apparatus. What remains most powerfully is the lesson the Ghost Army teaches about the nature of warfare itself. War is not merely about who possesses the most guns or the largest army. It is fundamentally about information and perception, about making the enemy believe something that is not true, about creating uncertainty and exploiting it. The Ghost Army understood this intuitively. They recognized that an inflatable tank that convinces the enemy to shift a real panzer division is worth more than a real tank in the wrong position. Their story also reminds us that warfare demands diverse skills. Modern militaries require not only infantrymen and tankers but also specialists who understand psychology, technology, and human perception. The artists and engineers of the Ghost Army were as essential to Allied victory as the soldiers who stormed the beaches and fought through the hedgerows. Different kinds of courage exist: the courage to face enemy fire, certainly, but also the courage to maintain a deception while knowing that discovery means death. As the last Ghost Army veterans pass away, their story transitions from living memory to history. Their legacy lives on in military deception doctrine, in the recognition that creativity and innovation are force multipliers, in the understanding that wars are won not only by those who fight but also by those who think. They were ordinary men who did something extraordinary. They created phantom armies and fooled Hitler's generals with rubber and paint and imagination. They saved lives without taking lives. They were warriors who fought with art instead of weapons, and they helped win the greatest war in human history. In the final accounting of World War II's countless acts of courage and sacrifice, the Ghost Army earned its place, the phantom division that became very real in its impact on history.